Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Collins, high quality student books, teacher guides, and unbeatable value revision for GCSE and A-level sociology. Sociology Show listeners can get 25% off Collins sociology resources until the end of December 2021, including a new book called How to Be a Sociologist, an inspiring introduction to studying sociology at A-level and university. If you want to take up this offer, simply head to collins.co.uk/sociology show and enter the code sociology show at the checkout. Terms and conditions apply. But as I say, that offer does run all the way up till December 2021. The Sociology Show podcast is also brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. So you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode, and I was delighted to be able to interview Dr Allison Hui. I'm not sure if I've said that correctly. I'll get her to say it properly, from Lancaster University. And in particular, we focused our discussion on the issues of methods and methodology. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, Alison. Thank you very much for joining me on the Sociology Show podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Alison. So let's start from the beginning. Do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So I am currently a lecturer and the director of our recruitment and admissions team in the Department of Sociology at Lancaster University. And my interest in terms of research tends to be both in practice theories, which derive from sort of this traditions of structuralist thought around structuration and Giddens' work and Bourdieu, as well as I have a real interest in research methods.
Excellent, thank you. And how do I say your surname, Alison? I've been looking at you on Twitter. I'm never not quite sure how to say it.
Yes, my surname is Hui, although I actually mispronounced it myself till I was older and learned Cantonese. So
that's fantastic. Thank you. So do you want to tell us first a little bit more about your own research? You've said about methodology, which we're going to dive into at some point. But do you want to tell us a little bit more broadly about sort of the research that you uptake?
Absolutely. So I have always had quite a diverse set of research interests, in part because some of the things that have been most centrally of interest to me are quite interdisciplinary. So when I was a master's student, I was interested in issues of migration and space and thinking about how people who move between different homes, either as migrants or having temporary homes in terms of second homes, for example, I was interested in their experiences in those relationships and practices they were building in very different parts of the world or the country that they were in. And then when I moved on to PhD study, I was interested in taking that further and looking at things around practice theory and how we can understand practices like leisure as taking us places in the world. And that led me to look at a lot of research around mobilities and how we can understand societies to be mobile inherently and involving all kinds of processes of people as well as objects moving around, and increasingly today, data and representations as well. So substantively, I've looked at different types of consumption, at migration, at mobility, and I was part of a project that was looking at energy research as well, and how we can understand our everyday consumption in relation to energy. So there have been lots of different substantive areas, but what's always been at the heart for me is really a passion for finding creative, different ways to create projects that are focused upon innovative methodologies, as well as a real passion for understanding diversity of practices, whether that's different types of leisure, whether that's looking at how different aspects of our everyday consumption of food and water and energy interlink with these broader systems around us, or whether that's looking at things like how people's interactions change as they migrate and remigrate between different countries in the world. So lots of different areas, but really some of the core issues and interests I think that many sociologists have around how we can understand experience and how we can design really interesting, exciting studies to capture something about that and interact with communities.
Thank you, Alison. And I wondered, for your own background, your own migration, how have you moved around within your career?
Yeah, it's a really important question because for me, I started in the Canadian system where I grew up, and I did my first 2 degrees in sociology in Canada. And then I came to do a PhD in Lancaster, actually, a number of years ago, and was able to learn more about British sociology and become involved with the British Sociological Association. And then I actually did a postdoc in Hong Kong, which was extremely interesting as well in terms of understanding how both sociology, but also geography, which I've interacted with a lot, are positioned outside of the West and sort of outside of the dominant countries that we might think of as producing contemporary sociological thinking. So I think that movement between different universities and different countries has really given me quite an interesting perspective upon both the challenges related to teaching and learning sociology in different places, as well as just, the fact that we have so many things in common, but there are also very clear distinctions between the way sociologists operate in different countries. And that's quite fascinating as well.
Yeah, definitely. I lived in the UK most of my life, but I lived in Kenya for a period and Spain for a year, and also traveled to lots of countries. And I'm a firm believer that you only really understand cultural differences when you live it, when you experience it empirically.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that, I've been in the UK for many years now, and I'm not quite sure if I'd be able to move back to Canada in some ways. I mean, I obviously miss friends and family, but there is just something so valuable about having that everyday interaction that really makes you a researcher in your own life as you're looking at those diversities and differences around you and trying to then think about the things that you learned when you were younger and how you can actually negotiate those differences, which, exist within any one city, country, society, but also just becomes so much more obvious and so much easier to enter into conversation around when you see the much more significant kinds of differences between countries or societies.
Definitely. And I was also interested in kind of your inspirations for the work that you do. You mentioned Giddens and Pierre Bourdieu. Is there anyone else in particular which has really kind of guided you in the areas that you look into?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And in some ways, I think I've been really inspired by a lot of work in geography. Some of Doreen Massey's work, a lot of the work of different geographers who are thinking about people's relationships to place have been quite interesting for me in terms of really recognizing, I think they're so relevant given some of the issues we have around sustainability as major social problems today, but also given the fact that so many people are interested in communities that very much are still grounded in some kind of space, whether it's a virtual one or a space we might be walking through in our everyday life. So that's one influence. And the other thing that I have actually more recently become really engaged with is some of the work, especially out of Australia, around changing educational practices, and the work of Stephen Kemmis in particular, who's written some really exciting things about how we can think about changing education and changing the way that we might lead as educational, researchers or as teachers. And I think some of that is really exciting work also.
And talking about education, do you work with Carolyn Jackson? Is she still based at Lancaster as well?
She is. Yes, she is. We're very lucky to have her right now as our associate dean in the faculty, looking at equality, diversity, and inclusion, which is just fantastic to have her expertise there.
Yeah, always a big favourite with the students, particularly her work on Ladette culture. They always enjoy studying that one.
Yes.
So let's get stuck into methodology. That's the key thing that I wanted to chat to you about. And your name popped up on Twitter because you were recently involved in an event where you gave a speech about methodology. Is that right?
Yes, I was very lucky to be a part of the very first event that the Teach Me Sociology Icons group was putting on as a pop-up. So there's a group of teachers who have just created this sociology-specific sort of group around the Teach Me icons. And they were having this lovely event on research methods that Les Back did the keynote for, and had a lot of fantastic short contributions from teachers. And one of the things that was so exciting to me about getting involved in that event is, I think, even though we obviously have very different constraints in terms of how we are approaching teaching methodology, and whether we're teaching it to, A-level exams, or whether we are teaching it in a university context. I think there are so many things that we share in terms of some of the challenges of engaging students and the need for creativity in how we approach the fact that often this is not students' favorite subject within the discipline. It's really great to be able to connect up with other teachers, because we really do share the fact that often students come into research method sessions or modules and are not necessarily predisposed to love them.
Agreed. Wait, before we get stuck into that, why do you think that is, that often people talk about teaching research methods as the dry part of sociology? But actually, I think it can be really inspiring as long as you sort of teach it alongside some of the fascinating studies that are out there.
I would agree with you. And I think in some ways, part of the challenge is that it can be approached, certainly in a lot of textbooks even, and writing about research methods and research methodology, it can be approached as something that involves sort of formulaic set rules. And some of that may come from sort of positivist traditions of needing to do research in a certain way. But I think one of the challenges with that is that it sometimes can seem like you have to spend so much time just talking about everything everyone else has done, and a long history of the development of particular epistemologies, particular methodologies, which it's really hard to think about. I'm not allowed to do any research until I've actually understood all of that or digested it. And I think that's one of the things that can be difficult as a teacher as well as a student, is when it feels like you have to have this huge understanding of the history before you can get stuck into the stuff that's really exciting and that makes researchers really excited to actually go out and interact with people.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of, once you've got your head around the basics, validity, reliability, representativeness, ethics, once you've got your head around the basics, it's kind of the scaffolding to build everything else on, isn't it? But you need to get the basics right first.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there is something about that, about needing to have a sense, obviously, about those key concepts. But one of the things I've been looking a lot more at recently is all of the discussions around decolonizing methodology. And, as somebody who doesn't traditionally, I haven't done research with Indigenous groups or with minority groups necessarily, it's really an interesting discussion for me, because I think the challenge is, how do we take seriously these calls to decolonize methodologies and recognize that research has been perpetuated in very unjust ways, when part of the problem is often that the history of research has sometimes made us approach it as something where we have the right to take knowledge from other people or to work with groups for a short period of time and then just leave them. Yeah. So I think that's, to me, where also, I don't think we should necessarily give up on privileging some of these key concepts like validity or reliability that are important for students to understand. But I think some of those discussions around decolonizing methodologies perhaps suggest that we need to think about how we might reposition them in terms of how we approach them, so that it's not just starting always with them, but perhaps situating them in that bigger conversation. I particularly like how Linda Smith talks about everyone can be researchers. There are already researchers all over society, even though they may not call themselves that. And I think even that is a really interesting starting point, not only for starting out students thinking about themselves already as researchers, but for thinking about how other people, if we're thinking non-sociologists who might be working in different organizations, they are already doing research, but with priorities that may not be first and foremost about reliability, but are also important for thinking about it. And I think there's something really exciting there in terms of thinking about research and situating it in these much broader conversations that link to other parts of what we might be teaching in sociology curriculum.
Yeah, I agree with that. I always say that to my students when we start it, that they're already researchers, because if you sit in a canteen or a coffee shop and you're nosy and you like to watch people, you're doing it already.
Absolutely. And I think that's the part that's really exciting as well, is that if you do start students out with some of those kinds of activities, then it's very easy for them to realize that's actually really interesting. I'm sure many sociology teachers of research methods have done some kind of cafe exercise with their students, but it is one that I've done with mine as well. And it's always so fascinating to see what they come back with when I send them out on campus to sit in different types of cafes or restaurants and observe and bring back what they are seeing, whether it's floor plans, whether it's observations about the type of music that was being played and what that says about an expected clientele, or whether it is counts of how many people came through and did different things with their rubbish as they were in the cafe. But it just opens up a completely different way for them to access all of those kinds of concepts that we might be trying to help them understand, and those kinds of different approaches to research that are part of the histories of research we want them to be aware of as well.
Yeah, agreed. And it's amazing just how different people's interpretations of the same event can be as well. I think that tells us a lot about the interpretation of situations and how people see things in different ways.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
So, Alison, can we get into a little bit more detail about what you were talking about at the event? What specifically was your focus for talking about methodology?
Yeah, so in a way, I called my presentation Resources for Thinking Methodologically, but really it was touching upon some of the things we've already been talking about and highlighting how I use different kinds of exercises in my own teaching as a way of getting students engaged. So the first thing I was talking about was emphasizing with my students that they are already thinking methodologically. And I actually do that even before I introduce them to any specific methodologies, before we talk about positivism or interpretivism. I start out in the very first week presenting them with a slide that has different possible things that people could value about research and what makes good research. So I give them a moment to think about which one of these kinds of statements they most agree with, whether they think research contributes to the production of compelling, creative, and accurate media and cultural representations, because we have a number of students who take the module and are studying media, or whether they perhaps think that the value of good research is that it can contribute rich descriptions of the world around us and bring our attention to aspects of people's experience that haven't been noticed before, or whether research is valuable because it builds relationships with people and environment and ideas, or whether perhaps it's valuable because it contributes to conclusive explanations of causes and effects that may have been previously unconsidered or misunderstood. And as you'll obviously probably know immediately, those possibilities have been crafted in order to sort of foreshadow things we'll talk about when we talk about established methodological perspectives. But I think what's so great is that it always starts the students into a conversation of recognizing they already are quite diverse in what they think would make something good about research. And it really starts for them a process of critical reflection that's really important for me in my teaching, in terms of helping them recognize that different aspects of what they might assume or have learned about research are often just one perspective in a much more messy, complicated, but also inspiring landscape of different ways that people are researching. And so it's a really lovely way to start the conversation off, where they aren't, students having to learn about these major traditions that they know nothing about and all of these terms, but rather starting them out from a position of, oh, I already know something, and now I can think a bit more about why that's what I'm drawn to, what that perhaps means when I'm trying to study these other methodologies that weren't the thing that I was initially drawn to, and how I can sort of think through that much more personally, which I know is sometimes a challenge for students when they are first encountering research methods and methodology in particular. Yeah, that's a really nice starting point, Matt. Where do you go from there? What's next? Yeah, it's interesting because I did, in my presentation, I did actually talk about things like, a cafe observation activity, which we've already touched upon. But one of the things that I think is really important about that, or any other kind of opportunity where students get to do research, and it was really great at this event that a number of the other teachers who were presenting, like Pete Bowdry, for example, were talking about these great activities they also do with their students to get them researching, things like doing covert and overt observation in classrooms in the school and recognizing the differences in that. But I think whatever the activity is, what's really important for me is that these kinds of experiences of doing a tiny bit of research themselves can be opportunities for us to not only show students sort of how you go about doing the research, but also to then help their methodological imagination. So after my students do a kind of cafe observation, one of the things that I do is debrief with them to talk about the different things that they observed, as you mentioned as well, how they might have picked up on different details of what's going on in the cafe, and then work through with them what that might mean for designing a study about those specific things, and pointing out how it might connect up to certain methodological assumptions in different traditions, or how if you were to engage more strongly with different methodological traditions, it might then shift how you approached following up on that observation that you had. So in that way, I think it's really helpful to keep coming back to these aspects of especially things like methodology that can be challenging for students to get their heads around, by coming back via what they're already experiencing and what they're already observing, so that they can really gain the skills of imagining what it's like to use that or to be a part of that type of methodological approach, and not only to be able to recite and parrot back sort of what some of the key principles have been in the past.
Do you find, Alison, that there's a preference for a certain approach? I always find that students are most excited by the idea of a covert participant observation, to really get stuck in and involved, and they see something like questionnaires that is a little bit dry and boring. Do you notice that sort of pattern when you ask students how they would approach something?
It's really interesting because I think with my students, there have often been different types of allegiances, I suppose, in that sense, that some of them absolutely want to go and speak to people. It's like, I need to do an in-depth interview. They fashion themselves, the next major broadcaster who's doing great interviews with whomever. But we also have some students who are really coming into our module with a sense that they want to do major generalizable surveys, and yet they don't necessarily have a sense of how complicated it is to actually create a really intriguing and useful survey that's helping us discover something new, and that isn't necessarily just the kind of public opinion polling that we might see a lot of organizations doing with a lot less rigor than we would as sociologists.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think sometimes that's kind of really misunderstood, even doing something like a survey or a questionnaire or something like that, just how difficult it is to get right, to get the wording right, to make sure you're not repeating yourself and actually getting the information you want. It's a lot of research methods are far more tricky than they first appear, aren't they?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think one of the challenges for me, which is another thing that I mentioned in my presentation, is trying to get students to be aware of some of those more creative possibilities of thinking through the challenging parts of any kind of research method or methodological approach. So one of the things that I really like using as an example in relation to surveys is some work that colleagues did as part of a project that was called the Patterns of Water Project. This was Martin Pullinger and Ali Brown and Ben Anderson and Will Med, who did a study that they were interested in people's use of water. And this was part of a real concern for water consumption and sustainability. But one of their methods was to do this major telephone survey. And what's so interesting about both their report that you can find online, as well as the survey questions you can also find online, is that it's really explicit, if you read the report alongside the questions, how they used particular theories to not just create a survey that is going to be yet another survey about people's attitudes and do you think we should save water, how important do you think sustainability is. They took a very different approach. So they asked questions like, what made somebody actually water any grass in their garden? And the potential options were things like, well, it's a certain day of the week, whether or not it has rained recently, whether or not the grass has turned a certain color. So it was very much trying to get a more complex understanding of how people use different types of information to inform what they do with water in their homes. And so it's just a wonderful example with my students, I find, because it helps them realize that what they often think of as survey questions is a very small set of the things you could possibly ask in a survey. And it also highlights that, some of these things, obviously they would have had to have a lot of qualitative research before designing this survey to understand what those possible options might be. And that aspect of how you need to know a lot before you start writing a survey is also something that students don't necessarily understand until they get an example like this or until they get stuck into trying to do it themselves.
Yeah, I suppose there's no better replacement for actually doing the research yourself, isn't it? It's all very well talking about it theoretically, but actually when you have a go at your own research, you soon realize the stumbling blocks and hurdles in front of you.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I think is really important actually about getting students involved with research, even if it's just tiny little activities or pilots, because it's through doing it that they then suddenly have all of these additional questions about how to do it better or why something happened a certain way. And I think that is where you can get really great conversations about not only how research is often used in some aspects of media coverage or journalism without really attending to the details that make us able to understand what it's really saying. But it also helps them to have that personal drive to want to find out more, to actually improve the way that they are thinking, and to recognize that when it comes to research, failing or getting things wrong isn't a problem at all, as long as you recognize that's part of the process and you're giving yourself time to adapt and adjust to, as you inevitably come across parts of your process that aren't going to work out the first time.
Yeah, agreed. And one of the things I've been chatting with my students about in recent classes, actually, we've been talking about the ability to be able to remain objective. And we kind of came to the conclusion that, is it almost impossible to remain objective? Do you think personal biases and personal opinions and so on always do come into play with research at some point?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's one thing that's interesting in terms of a contrast potentially between the kind of way that the curriculum for A-level is laid out as a sort of foregrounding objectivity, and the way that a lot of researchers in universities might themselves think of how they're positioned in relation to something like objectivity and subjectivity. Because, discussions of sort of post-positivism and the way that the methodological conversations have moved on, there are a lot of researchers, I work with colleagues, who are absolutely committed to large-scale surveys and the value of the analysis of large quantitative data sets. And yet those colleagues would never say that they're trying to remain objective purely in some sense that they feel like they can separate themselves from their research. So I think it is really important to highlight that with students, that we might want to think about objectivity in terms of what effect we're having on research, but that it is more about our process of reflecting upon that relationship than necessarily striving to be perfectly objective in any kind of ideal way, because that really isn't possible.
No, exactly. I mean, one of the things that in relation to that is any study that seems to be released, whether you see something come online or new data has just found so-and-so, it does seem to get ripped apart, doesn't it? The sort of critical analysis of new research and findings is probably more in depth than it's ever been.
Yeah, and I think that's really encouraging, the spaces where we see that, because it does say something about the fact that people are developing more of a methodological, imagination to be able to understand what's going on. But I think there is still work to be done. I mean, drawing back again to decolonizing methodology, it's like, in some ways, ideals of things like being objective or of, criticizing certain research, it depends how we're criticizing it, and what that conversation is, because scholars, certainly Indigenous scholars, and many others, have been criticizing for many years the problems with some of the types of research that have come out and what types of knowledge they're really privileging. And I think that's where it is important we're also critical about what the critiques are and whether they are more of the same or whether they're really helping us to think about how we can be more inclusive and more open in terms of our understandings of what might make for valuable research that's going to help different, diverse communities.
Agreed. Yeah, I guess you have to have quite a strong backbone as a researcher these days, don't you? You know that you're going to get sort of ripped to shreds at some point by various critiques.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in some cases that's certainly true, and there are some colleagues who will do research in areas that it is very sensitive, but I also have a good degree of optimism, because one of the things I think is really exciting right now, with so many discussions of public engagement and the importance of having more conversations about how research makes an impact, is that I think it's also creating more space for researchers who really want to do research with communities and that respond to the needs of particular communities. And I think that's really exciting to me, because it really highlights that it's if you're working in different ways, like intensively with a particular community, you may have critiques still coming about your work, but as long as you're working with that community in a way that is beneficial to all of you, those external critiques might not matter quite as much as they would in other contexts also. So I think that's one thing that perhaps is shifting a bit in terms of whether or not we're talking about sort of one general public that ends up critiquing research in particular ways, or whether we're thinking more specifically about how, whether they're academics or just sociologists working outside of academia, there are sociologists who are making extremely important contributions to much smaller communities that are drawing upon their research skills and expertise.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. It's good to question things anyway, isn't it? That's what we should do as good sociologists.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Alison. Could I ask you just to give out a few more details about yourself? Maybe people want to find out more about your work or follow you on Twitter.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter at everydayally. That's ALLIE. And I am certainly very happy to follow up with anybody about any of these issues, or certainly any issues around sort of the conversation between schools and universities. And it's something that I think is extremely important because to me, sociology students are sociology students across the board, and the more we can be interacting to actually support some of these conversations around issues that we share is the better. There is one other thing that I'd love to mention, because I think one question that Carrie Stoughton raised in the Pop-Up Research Methods event that I was speaking at is something that I think is really important. She was asking Les Back, actually, after his presentation about how teachers can actually access contemporary research, because, it's so difficult with all the pressures of teaching in schools and colleges often to figure out how you can get in touch with some of the great research that's going on. And I loved Les's answer. You can go watch the recording, and he did give an answer that was putting some of the pressure really on those of us working in universities. But I think the other thing I thought would be useful to add to that is that, I think some of this, that we've been talking about in terms of getting our sort of students involved in imagining how they can be researchers, or in searching out different kinds of sources and experiences that help them bring that to life. I think some of that is definitely something teachers already are tapping into. And I think part of what we can do is just value what so many teachers are doing already, like yourself with this podcast, to sort of enrich that conversation around sociology. So whether it's things like looking at contributions to the Festival for Social Science that's run every year, or whether it's connecting up with other teachers and academic researchers on Twitter, or looking at some of the great websites and platforms where people are sharing their research, like The Conversation and Discover Sociology, and the fantastic Connected Sociologies website that's addressing some of the issues around decolonizing curriculum. I think so much is already going on that I'd actually just really say that if I was a teacher, I don't think it would be as important to read the journal articles necessarily as it is to just engage in some bit of this broader conversation around sociology, because I think so much of that is useful in a way that's probably really accessible, much more so now than it was a few decades ago.
Yeah, totally agree. I've noticed that myself teaching sometimes, and you say this study was done in 1962, and you think, surely I could find something a little bit more fresh and contemporary. But I totally agree, and I hope. Thank you for mentioning the podcast. I hope some things like the podcast do send out some new studies and research for students to listen to as well.
Absolutely, and that's the thing that none of us has the time to be aware of everything going on all of these fronts, but it's really fantastic that we have these kinds of resources, because then you can dip in when it's important, and you can find things when you need them, and I think that's really helpful in terms of enriching the broader conversation around sociology.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Alison. I really do appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Matthew. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You take care. Bye now.
Bye now.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.